Okay, great to have everyone back again. Blue. Perfect. Okay. As soon as it works. Okay, awesome. Everyone, welcome again back. Everyone who's here. If you weren't here, welcome to the first time. Last time we got together, we really gave more of an introduction to Torah in general. Before we start, one thing everyone should just know that Rabbi loves YJC, but he has a meeting at 9 o'clock, so it's not out of dislike for anyone in the room that he might have to leave.
Yeah, sure.
It's because he loves him. That's why he has to go. So just no one should think anything negative of him. Okay, enough with the plugs. Last week we spoke about the introduction to Torah and Creation, oral law, the written law, proofs of the divinity of the Torah, various things like this. Today we're going to actually we're going to dive in to the actual first chapter of the Torah itself. I'll pass out in a second anyway, you gotta take one if you don't pass out. It's just it's a photocopy of the English of the first chapter. We're not gonna spend too much time looking at it, so don't get nervous. We're not like spending too much time reading, but we'll look at a few verses, so keep it in mind. Okay, so the basic difficulty that we're facing here in studying Genesis is as follows. Does anybody recognize who this person may or may not be? Look familiar to anyone? I have no clue as to the accuracy of this picture, but when you Google images his name, they all look like this.
Is that Yochanan Kremitzer?
What? It's not Yochanan Kremitzer, no. Perhaps
Rashi?
No, you guess? This is allegedly a picture of Rambam, or Maimonides. Maimonides was, in addition to a fantastic scholar, law decisor, and many other great Jewish accolades, he was one of the greatest Jewish philosophers. And anyone here been to Chicago? I know the Harrises have.
Woo.
Anyone been to...
We had a Burke with us once.
Oh yeah?
Yeah.
So anyone do you guys go to the restaurant joint called Milt's Barbecue for the Perplexed?
I told you to go there.
You did?
Yeah,
You
guys went there?
Yeah.
Now I want to.
You want to? Okay, so there is a kosher barbecue joint in Wrigleyfield near where the Cubs play called Milt's Barbecue for the Perplexed. And he based this name, in case you couldn't guess, on a book of Rambam. Rambam wrote a book called The Guide to the Perplexed. In Hebrew it's known as Moreh Nevuchim. And he really, it's a philosophical work in which he discussed the Torah's philosophy relative to other philosophies of his time. So if you're ever in Chicago, I haven't actually been there yet either, but I've heard it's amazing. So check it out. The Rambam is discussing the prevalent idea of his time, which was really started earlier with Aristotle.
What's the years of...
The Rambam?
Yeah.
Rambam lived from 1135 to 1204. So I don't know exactly when this book was written in there, but that was when he lived. So that span. So the prevalent scientific idea of his time was that the world just always existed. So he wrote a whole chapter in the Guide to the Perplexed in which he was talking to secular philosophers and explaining to them the issue or the difficulty in understanding Genesis. And he writes the following thing. So imagine you have a father and a son having a deep conversation, and unfortunately this son's mother, who's not in the picture, passed away when he was a young infant. And he grew up alone with his father, and his father moved to a town where everyone was male. There were no females anywhere in the town. And there were no female dogs and nothing female. Everything was male. And as he grew up, he's probably, 8, 9? Anyone? How old do you think he is? 8, 9? So as he gets older, he looks to his father, and in this deep conversation, he says, "Dad, where did I come from? How did I get here?" So his father peers back in his eyes. His father looks at him, his father says, "Well, there's a creation called a woman. It's kind of like similar to you relative to other animals, but with a few minor differences. And you grow for 9 months, you're inside of this woman's stomach." And the kid bursts out laughing. And he says, "You need to eat and drink to be alive. You need to breathe to be alive. How could you do that when you're inside of someone else?" He's like, "And then what happens?" He's like, "Well, then she opens up and she lets you out." He's like, "But how would you go to the bathroom? This doesn't make any sense." He says, I don't believe this. Doesn't make any sense." So the message that Rambam was saying to him was that to try to understand concepts that are outside of our world of experience is an extremely difficult thing. Imagine if you've never even seen a female before. So the concept, we grew up knowing, there's men and there's women, and there's a way to have children, and we've seen infants before, and we know what happens, so it makes sense to us. But imagine you never saw that before. So trying to imagine such a concept, it's like impossible. Like, but we need to breathe, we need to go to the bathroom, we need to eat. So the basic difficulty that Rambam is explaining in understanding creation is the entire concept is really outside of our world of experience. We live in a world that exists. We live in a world that has what it is already. It's hard for us to imagine nothing and then something coming because we don't have any equivalence of that in our life. So that's a difficulty, and it's just something to recognize, and we'll deal with this. In Kabbalah, there's a concept, which is that this world is similar to a fruit. And that's a real bug, you know?
Yeah, crawling on it.
It's crawling on my apple. That's weird. It's cool on the apple, no? It's like one of those like.
It was like 3D for a moment.
We don't normally have spiders crawling around on the apple. So in Kabbalah, there's a concept that is that this entire world that we live in is called a fruit. There's a spiritual world that's kind of the roots, and that roots gives forth, and the branches, and those branches give forth fruit. And the extent, the end point of all that is a fruit. Our world is called the fruit of the spiritual world. And the concept is that, similar to what the Rambam was saying, if you have an apple, and you live in, I don't know, where's a place where there's no trees? Brooklyn have trees? I feel like it's all like cemented buildings there, right? I don't know, you live somewhere where there's just cement around. You've never seen grass. You've never seen a tree. You look at this apple and you say, well, where did this come from? You could study it forever. You'll never discover unless you take a seed inside of it and plant it. By looking at the apple, it's almost impossible to discover where that apple came from. You don't see a brown tree, a brown trunk with roots 20 feet in the ground. You can't see any of that. If you know it because we know it exists, then you know there's a beautiful tree behind it. But the apples themselves, by definition, they hide their source. And Kabbalah says, does anyone know how to say the world? How do you say the world in Hebrew?
Olam.
Olam, right? Kol ha'olam kulo. Ha'olam is the world. The word in Hebrew for hidden is ha'elem, which is almost the exact same word. And the concept, as explained by Kabbalah, is that our world really hides its source. That's part of our struggle in this world of believing in God and figuring out, does God exist, does he not, how do I relate to him? Part of that struggle is because we can't just see God. That's where the word comes from, right? We're just living in this apple, and we're trying to analyze the apple and see that it came from a tree, and we've never even heard of a tree before. We've only lived with cement. It's an extremely difficult concept. And that's part of the difficulty really in studying Genesis. Despite this difficulty, it's something to bear in mind. We're still going to go full force into Genesis, but there is a certain inherent complication with really 100% understanding the entirety of creation, which is really something that's not really possible for us to understand exactly what was before the world existed and after. That being said, quick test. Who remembers from last week? Ooh, you guys didn't know you could be tested. This is exciting. Who remembers from last week what we said the purpose of the Torah is? It's on YouTube, so you can check quickly right now if you want. And remember, the purpose of the Torah, we said that the word Torah, remember what the word Torah comes from? We said Torah is actually short for the word Torah Chaim. Torah Chaim means instruction for life. This might look familiar. The Torah is indeed the instruction manual for life. That's really what Torah is, right? The word Torah means instruction, and the purpose of Torah is to help guide us to become great people. Right? We're here, we're in a complex, difficult, gray world, and we're trying to learn how to make ourselves the greatest people we can be. Torah is meant as a guide to help us become the greatest people we can be. So there's an obvious question. We're going to start Genesis in a few minutes, and everyone know more or less what the book, there's 5 books of Moses, right? There's 5 books of the written law. The first one is Genesis. Does anybody know what the gist of Genesis discusses? It starts with creation, that's what we're focusing on. And it continues with the stories of the generations from Adam till Noah. There's the great flood of Noah. That continues with the generations until Abraham. Then we get more detailed into the lives of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And really the entire book of Genesis is mostly, apparently, seemingly stories. So, the basic question is, if the purpose of the Torah is just to help us be great people. So if you go to the self-help shelf in Barnes & Noble's, you're not going to find the history of the world, right? You're not going to find creation in there. You're not going to find books about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So the question is, why do we have all these stories in Genesis? What's the point of it? Why don't we just start Genesis with the laws? Tell me how to be a great person. Don't steal. Don't kill. Be nice. Love your fellow person, right? All of the laws of the Torah. Why are we going through this like 40-something chapters of all Genesis? Interesting question. So Rashi, we mentioned last time that there's two parts to the Torah, right? There's the written law and there's the oral law. It would be hard to know all of the oral law when you're reading the Chumash. So we have the advantage. There was a tremendous rabbi, whose picture unfortunately I did not bring, and his name was Rashi, and he basically brings in, on the written law, on the Torah, he brings in the explanation of the oral law to help us understand it. So Rashi, in his first comment on the Torah, actually asks this question. He says, what are we doing now? Why do I care about creation? Okay, God created the world. It's good to know, but what does that have to do with Torah? Why don't you just tell me how to make myself great? Why do I need to know that? So Rashi does an amazing thing, and it's a very fundamental idea to think about if you ever have a chance, which is highly recommended, to read through the book of Genesis, a perspective on Genesis. And what Rashi says is that the Torah is teaching you throughout all of Genesis the concept of basically cause and effect. The concept that our actions have inherent meaning and value. It's not as if we do something and the next day it's gone. When we do something, there's an effect it has on the world around us. We find stories, and in one story, Abraham will do something great and we'll find that he's rewarded. He passes a test and God gives him great things. The entire story, the people in the times of the flood, they're bad, they get wiped out. The whole story of Genesis, the whole concept of the whole book is to teach us, before you want to be a great person, recognize how valuable you are, how much potential you bring to the table, how much you can do, and realize how significant your actions are. And that's why we see like this whole world that was created. What's the end game we're going to get to not in this class? But God created, there were 6 days of creation and then Shabbos. The end of creation, what was created? Man. That man was the last creation, symbolizing that this entire process was a build-up. The build-up was we have light and we have dark and we have water and we have animals, we have plant life and then we get to people. People was already, that's the purpose. These people are what the world is for, and then Shabbos is next, which means Shabbos is also important. We'll get there later. But to recognize that us, if we're here and we're Jews and God put us in this world, we could be really great people and our actions have tremendous value. And that's where the message of the whole book of Genesis. So without further ado, let's get started. Does everybody have a copy of it? I have just I only copied the English side. I figured it'd be easier for everyone. Can we get a volunteer to read the first 5? Let's read all 5 verses together. 5 the first day. Any volunteers? It's not so scary. Everyone will be nice to you. Don't worry about it. Mark, you want to take it? Go for it.
In the beginning of God's creating the heavens and the earth, when the earth was astonishingly empty, with darkness upon the surface of the deep, and the divine presence hovered upon the surface of the waters, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God separated between the light and the darkness. God called to the light day, and to the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, one day.
Come on, we give this guy a round of applause. That was fantastic, Mark.
I'm so literate.
You know? No one else will want to take the plunge, you know? You stepped up, you took it. Great job. We'll give you credit for it. Don't worry, there'll be more to read, everyone. Don't worry. We'll get there. I don't know about today, but... Okay, so the first verse, I read about the English here, but as I mentioned in the last class, we spoke about last time the divinity of the Torah relative to other religions, certain proofs in the Torah itself that imply that it was written by a being that must be more knowledgeable than anything alive because of the extent of certain things mentioned. Anyone who wants some more details, we could talk after, or you can listen to the class. So given the fact that the Torah is divine and it was written by God, the nuance of each word and how it's written, and sometimes you have certain synonyms, and the fact that you chose one word over the other word, maybe if we're just having a casual conversation, doesn't mean so much. Okay, he said it like that, he said it like that. But if God's writing his message to the world, every word is significant how it says it. So the first word of the Torah, and remember what it was from last week in Hebrew? Bereshit, right? Perfect. Bereshit. So what does the word Bereshit mean? So often we think it means, oh, look at that, you have it up here. I forgot about that. Often we think that what Bereshis means is the first thing God created, right? Bereshis bara Elohim, in the beginning God created heavens and earth, which would imply that what did God first create? Heavens and earth, right? If you read it like that. And you'll notice the art scroll knows what I'm about to say already, so they didn't translate it as that. But if you would just take a look, there's two words in Hebrew that are similar words. One is Bereshit, which means in the beginning, and one is Barishona, which means first, really. So in here, we find that the word Bereshit, you might think it means first, but God in fact did not create the heavens and the earth. How do we know that? Because if you read further, and everyone wants to read the 7 days in advance before next class, you're welcome to get a big picture, because we're going to try to contrast different verses and stuff to figure them out. But I'll point it out as we go on. The earth wasn't uncovered. The waters were separated off the earth on day 3. So it couldn't be that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, because the earth didn't exist yet. Earth, according to the Torah itself, only came into existence later. So that can't be. So it doesn't mean it was created first. So what does it mean? What it means is, in the beginning of creation, you kind of have to, the way that Rashi explains, you have to read the first 2 verses of the Torah, is there really an introduction to the entire chapter of creation. Meaning, what we're saying is, in the beginning of the creation of the heavens and the earth, which is what we're going to discuss now for the next 2 chapters, or chapter plus, while the world was astonishingly empty, etc., then the first point of creation starts at verse 2. Then God said, let there be light, and there was light, right? The first point of creation is actually verse 3. So the first 2 verses, their function is just an introduction in the beginning of creation. These are not actually starting the actual creation, that starts in verse 3. Okay. Now, the second word. The first word is Bereshis, right? Bereshis means the beginning of creation, we're explaining. The second word is the word bara. And bara is a very important word in terms of understanding creation also. When we think of creation, often what comes to our minds is something like this picture here, right? Some kind of mad scientist, he's mixing elements and potions, and he's taking different things and he's creating something new, right? He created a new, whatever he created, I don't know. That's often what creation means. Creation in our world generally means we have certain things that exist, and we're going to use them and fashion them and develop them to turn them into a new product. But the word bara is a very unique word. We find it very, very rarely. There is a great rabbi, I'll show you another picture now. A great rabbi, this rabbi, there were no good pictures, so it's a little blurry, I apologize. This rabbi is Ramban, Nachmanides. He overlapped the end of his life with Rambam. They overlapped maybe for 10 years. He was also a tremendous Jewish philosopher as well. He was 1194 to 1270. And he wrote an amazing explanation of the Torah also. It's kind of like with Rashi, the number 2. Rashi's like the number 1. You read Rashi with the Torah or you just can't read the words. The number 2 is really Ramban, or Nachmanides in English. And he adds in a lot of like perspective and a lot of deeper understanding to a lot of these things. So he explains that the word bara actually means creation ex nihilo. Anyone? I always pronounce words wrong. What's the word?
I think it's Nilo or Nilo.
I think it's nihilo.
You don't say the H.
Okay, ex nihilo. It's there. I don't know. I gotta say it. It's there. Yeah. Okay. Anyways, anyone know how to pronounce that word? No takers? No, ex nihilo. It's all good. So anyone know what ex nihilo means? The Latin for? Say again?
Oh, I just said it's a good thing I didn't have to read that.
That's okay. Evidently, none of us really know how to read it, so it's fine. Ex nihilo is Latin for something from nothing. Creation ex nihilo is a concept that there was nothing that existed. There was just God in the world. And God created something from nothing. Right? In general, that is a very rare concept, and Ramban explains on amazing things. He said that there was a Yesod Dak She'ein Bo Mamash. That's the words of mine. Yesod Dak She'ein Bo Mamash, which literally means there was a teeny tiny foundation. Now bear in mind, this is written in the early 1200s, that has no real substance to it. I've heard people quote it as someone like, this is a mustard seed actually, on someone's hand, just to the relative size of it. They say it was roughly the size of a mustard seed, and he writes it in Greek, this concept is called hiyuli, and in Hebrew this concept is called tohu. The second verse says, "V'ha'aretz hayisa tohu vavohu." The land was tohu and vohu. What does tohu mean? The Ramban says tohu means this initial spark of creation. What God did was God took whatever nothingness means, it's a concept that's very difficult for us to understand, and He created something. He created a speck of something that was just about infinitesimally small, but it had within it the ability to produce everything from. Yeah? That's what the word bara means. Now, this is a really crazy idea. I forgot the book. A few weeks ago, those of you that were in New York, Rabbi Ari Sashstein spoke to us like before the third meal. If I remembers, he was a guy with cool hair. Server guy. So he mentioned that, I forgot if anyone remembers what book he quoted, that the greatest novelty that the Jews added to world thinking was that the world had a creator, right? The world had creation. Everyone had always believed, like Rambam was speaking to, that the world just always existed. It was a continuous world that just always was. Nachmanides is explaining here, and this is an agreed upon. You can look in, I can show you again, anything that I say, I hope you challenge me on. I'm happy to show it to you, anything. It's not like, I'm not trying to get anything past you, really. Call me, I'd ask any questions. If you want to look things up inside, I can show you inside. This is something that Nachmanides wrote in the early 1200s. This is actually a copy of a text of what Nachmanides wrote on the Torah. Cool thing there. And he wrote that our world started as a tiny speck, that from that, in the rest of the chapter of creation, we don't find this word bara anymore. It uses words of yatzar, meaning fashioned, or asa, meaning made. And it uses different words of God fashioning from this initial creation everything else in the world. Right? That is what Ramban explains. That is all in the word bara. Now I want you to appreciate this for a second, because in as recently as 1959, here's a cover of Nature magazine in 1959. You might know it more. It looks like this nowadays. It's come up with the times a little bit. Nature magazine is a pretty accepted, well-known magazine. In 1959, they had a survey of scientists in those days, and they asked the scientists in 1959, what was the beginning of the world? How did the world start? And 66% of the scientists surveyed in 1959 said, what do you mean? The world just always existed. What do you mean, what happened in the beginning of the world? There's no beginning. The world was. That was in the past 50 years. Nowadays, if you ask most people, the generally accepted concept is, and we'll come back to this, is the Big Bang. Right? Most people accept the Big Bang, which is that based on Einstein's theory of general relativity, that space and time is expanding, which means that if you trace that back, they're going to keep expanding smaller and smaller until you can trace it back to one point. That might have been extremely oversimplified, but more or less, that's the concept, right? Our world is constantly expanding. And that's the generally accepted scientific understanding. Now, which if you think about it, it's like a very interesting thing, that when Einstein produced the theory of general relativity, he actually was not a believer in the Big Bang. Einstein believed strongly in what was known as the static state theory, which is how the world always existed. And Einstein actually said that if science ever proves, which didn't happen in his lifetime, if science ever proves that the Big Bang is really what happened, then that proves that God created the world. Because in his mind, that's basically validating the biblical story, right? We always said the world just always was. That's what science always said. The world always was. And as recently as the past 40 years, think about that in terms of history, in the past 40 years, recently science has come around and said, actually, based on our understanding now, the world really started from it's a hard word to say, infinitesimally small point called the Big Bang, and from that, it not expanded, let's say, not really exploded, it expanded and produced our world. So it's something to appreciate that, 1,000 years later, after the turn of things of 2,000 years, science is now agreeing with that, which is an amazing thing. That's almost like that. Now imagine I had to give this class 100 years ago. So some people might look familiar. So I'd be talking to some fine fellows here, trying to talk to these wonderful Jews.
Mark, feels like you're from the 20s.
And I'm going to tell them that,
Yeah, you sure?
I could just send you the picture if you want. I'm going to tell you that, the world had a starting point, and God created the world, and the scientific community and everyone in the picture then would all just laugh and say, like, what do you mean? Now until there was one small speck, and from that speck came zebras, and came rocks, and came water, and came hydrogen, and came trees, and came everything in creation was an extension from that initial creation ex nihilo, that initial energy, that initial something, everyone would laugh. But nowadays we have the advantage of science being on our side, but I want everyone to just appreciate that that's an amazing thing. The Torah has been saying this, and the Jews have this tradition and have been believing this for thousands and thousands of years. And we'll get more to the Big Bang, whether or not it fits with the Torah or doesn't with the Torah. But the most basic thing that the Big Bang proved was that the world has a starting point, which is an amazing thing to say. Because historically, we grew up with that thought process. So again, we kind of think that's normal. But that's as recent as 40 years ago, really. In the 60s, it really only became accepted. In the 70s more. We'll talk later about another concept that kind of proved it. But for now, that's just an amazing thing to think about. Okay, so this here is the Big Bang, as most charts, if you Google images, kind of explains each line here is 1 billion years. This is time 0, right? Because with the Big Bang, the basic concept of the Big Bang is there was, we'll get to the beginning in a second, but basically there was a point, and that point expands. And that's why this is still expanding outwards, and time and space only exist within this, whatever this is. It's in the Big Bang.
Is that like
over
Earth
here
is in the middle of that?
Say again?
Is that like Earth is in the middle of the
Somewhere in there.
I don't know exactly where it
planets
is, but everything that we know exists, all the galaxies, all creation,
galaxies, yeah.
all exists within this circle.
Yeah.
Right? Over here is all nothing. Nothing means nothing. There's no time, there's no space, there's nothing. If you want to know more on this, this is part of, look up Einstein's theory of general relativity. You can talk about it after the class. I can explain a little bit more. I understand parts of it, but it does require more complex studies, I think, than this. But the basic concept is that this is the Big Bang, this is the initial amount, there's different ages here, and we'll come to this. Now the question is, and what they basically proved was, once you prove the world is expanding, if you trace it backwards, that means it's shrinking. So if you keep shrinking it forever, eventually it should shrink into one smallest thing you can make it. That's the logic, basically. So if you go to a lot of interesting websites, this is from a website called space.com. It's a pretty well-accepted, valid source of information for scientific stuff on this. So on the piece of the Big Bang, I want to read to you, there's one thing it has here. It says here, so the very beginning of the universe remains pretty murky. Scientists think they can pick this story up at about 10 to the minus 36 seconds after the Big Bang, right? Which is 1/1,000,000,000 of a trillionth of a trillionth of a second. It's pretty good. After the Big Bang. So what are they missing though? They can get back, they can trace our world, and they can tell you more or less how they understand everything happened back to the trillionth of a trillionth of a trillionth of a second. And then they're stuck. And this is what science is working on. You go read articles now, they're trying to figure this out. Well, what triggered the Big Bang? There was nothing before the Big Bang, so how could there be a Big Bang? This is the big question of science, right? And there's no answer. You can look around. It's a great question. There's no answer. Why? Because the answer is spark. That's the answer, right? The answer is that there was one spark of creation, ex nihilo, that God created, which is the word bara in the Torah. Again, Bereshis means beginning of creation. Bara is God created one infinitesimally small speck that expanded, and from that he withdrew the entire world. So this is I'm not making anything up. Everybody please go home, do your homework, look it up. I'm presenting to you the exact facts. So far, science seems to fit fine with everything we've said, and if anything, it's actually brought much closer to what the Torah's been saying the whole time. Because the Torah's always been claiming there's a creator in the beginning, they've proven the beginning, they've gone out from it, and they're just stuck at that first beginning of where did that come from, how did that get there, what is that? Which is pretty cool, pretty amazing. Okay, so that's Bereshis, Bara. Again, Bereshis is the beginning of the creation. Bara is the one-time creation, ex nihilo, some people say nilo, of the world. Now, again, we mentioned before that the first and second verse is somewhat of an introduction to the creation. So the second verse says, and the land was, what did it say exactly? It was astonishingly empty, which is, so listen to this is amazing. The ha'aretz haisa tohu v'ohu, the land was tohu and vohu. Now tohu, Rabbi explains, the word tohu means this point of creation. Tohu is the way we say something that is extremely small, within it contains the possibility for everything. That's what the word tohu means. And the word bohu is actually a contraction of two Hebrew words, of bo-hu, which means tohu means it's infinitesimally small, Bohu means in it. Who is it? Meaning in it is everything. The tohu and bohu means it's an infinitesimally small point, and in it is everything in creation. That's what the words of Torah say. That's the beginning of verse 2. Now the Medrash, so I don't know if we spoke about Medrash or not. I'll just mention what exactly Medrash is. So there's the basic words of the Torah. Now we mentioned the Torah can be understood on a lot of different varying levels. There's the simple understanding when you go to like Kabbalah. What is Kabbalah? Kabbalah is a whole different way, it's a whole different system of learning Torah. It's like a different level of understanding. So there's multiple layers, really 4 primary layers called Pshat, Remez, Drash, and Sod, 4 different layers of understanding. So the Medrash often will bring out concepts from the verse that are not necessarily explicit in the verse, but it's somewhat a way of interpreting the verse in somewhat of an allegorical way sometimes, different ways it works, to bring out a message. So the Medrash says here, and this is really a question, what is the second verse doing? The land was desolate and empty and dark, and he gives a lot of adjectives to describe it. And then it goes on with creation. So the Medrash explains, this isn't just randomly telling you that it was dark and empty and nothing going on. But it was actually telling you the purpose of the world. And what is that purpose of the world? The purpose of the world is, watch out. Verse 2, it was desolate, and it was empty, and it was, what are the good English words? Astonishingly empty. And there was all these things going on, and then all this goes on until you hit verse 3. What's verse 3? Let there be light. Right? That's the world, the Medrash says. We start off with dark, until we hit the light. And that's our goal, is to work through these struggles, work through these challenges, and get to the light. Right? Get to that truth, struggle through that, and push our way through it. That's really what this verse is telling me. And there's a fascinating Medrash. There are 4 exiles. Tell me if you're familiar with the concept. There's 4 exiles that the Jews have gone through from the establishment of the Jewish nation until modern day where we are now, in 4th exile, until the rebuilding of the 3rd temple. 4 exiles. 4 exiles are, there's the Babylonian, that's an empire, but the Babylonian exile, the Persian exile, the Greek exile, and the Roman exile. Right? Those are the 4 exiles that the Jews have gone through in our history. And the Medrash actually learns each one of these adjectives of this verse is referring to another one of these exiles. And the verse is actually hinting towards the whole history of the Jews. Verse 1, there's a creator. God created. How long is it going to be for? We spoke about last time, 6,000 years of creation. Verse 2, what's the point? You're going to go through these exiles, and what's the point of these exiles? The struggle of the exile helps us get that light. There's a concept called nitzotos in Hebrew, sparks of holiness. In different places, there are different sparks of holiness. And our job is to go to these countries and go to these different parts of the world and kind of find God everywhere in the world. And reconnect all the pieces of the world to God, and through that, create the full picture. Just an example, I saw a great article on Chabad.org that they were talking about Pokemon Go, and they gave an example that, like, to imagine this concept of these sparks of holiness around everywhere, it's kind of like little Pokemon Go's on all the different exiles, right? Like we have, basically, each exile, it looks, you don't even see it there. Like if you're just looking without your phone, it looks like a totally normal world, right? But in real life, there's these spiritual Pokemonsters that are hanging out in different parts of the world, and our job as Jews, in a certain sense, is to really go around and gather all of these Pokemonsters from around the world, and everyone's looking at us like, what are you doing? It's just a field over there. You're like, no, I'm praying in this field. You're praying in this field? Well, then I'm going to elevate this field to like a higher sphere. And that's basically a Pokemonster. No, am I crazy? I thought that was a great article by Chabad. Anyways, like, you don't see it, but if you know what you're looking at, or you have the right phone, the right lens to see it, then you're able to see this concept. And our goal of creation is, we're going to go through these exiles, we're going to have these challenges, we're going to have these struggles, and through that we're going to be able to get to verse 3, which is to get to this light. And that's really the concept of what we're all here for. That's all of us. Growth comes from struggle. It's not a new concept that we all know. We didn't all know that there are Pokemonsters into the exile, but we did all know that growth comes from struggle. Okay, so that's really the first 2 verses. Let me know if I'm going too fast or if I'm missing things. So far we haven't had any questions, which I hold is terrible, because that either means that I'm like the best speaker of all time, or that you're just not asking questions. So if there are any questions, we'll stop for a second. If there are any questions, anyone wants to ask anything, to review it quickly. Yeah, please.
I have one question. So, how do you, I guess...
I really thought I was the best speaker.
Oh.
I was thinking you were a great speaker.
You're a great speaker. I don't want you to feel
I'm
otherwise.
just kidding.
But I guess how have like both the Big Bang and creation in the Bible? Like how do those like work together, I guess?
Great question. So the question, I guess, really is what exactly happened in the Bible description? What exactly happened during the Big Bang? And then do those stories match up? So is there a specific point that you're asking from that's problematic, or you're just asking a general question of...
I'm just asking in general.
In general. So,
yeah.
in general, this is Moshe Segal's understanding. Could be people who are arguing with me on this. Could be they call me heretical, I don't know. As far as I understand it, there is not really any real problem with understanding the Torah's view of creation in congruence with the Big Bang. I happen to think it fits very nicely. We'll discover more similarities in a second. The basic point, and I think this is why a lot of people have this like background feeling of like evolution can't be with the Torah, and Big Bang can't be with the Torah, and none of these things can't fit together. The basic Jewish idea is that God created the world. That's really like the underlying principle. If you can accept that God created the world, these are really all details of it. So how exactly did the world come out? So we don't know from the Torah how exactly it will come out. There's 25 verses of everything in the world. You think we can understand from that every single detail of every single thing? God told us what we need to know. We can understand a lot from it. But are we going to know absolutely everything? No. So if you're suggesting scientifically you can see or you can prove certain parts of it, as long as it fits the Torah, I have no problem accepting that. That's great. Science is wonderful. The general perspective of Torah on science is they go with science. We never disagree with science. It's not like comes up a lot in medicine and other areas. We generally trust science and we try our best. If there's a direct conflict with it, which is extremely rare, maybe we'd go with the Torah. But in general, there's not a conflict. In the Big Bang itself, that's what I was saying. The Big Bang scientifically, if you talk to scientists, so God is a very non-scientific concept. You can't prove it. He's not testable. He exists outside of our world of a science lab. So we can't prove scientifically that God exists. Therefore, you can take the Big Bang and you can go back to the last trillionth of a second and go all the way back to the beginning, and then you're stuck. So when science comes up with a reason of what that is, how that got there, and we'll have to then decide, well, does the Torah agree with that? Then maybe there'll be like a conflict there. For now, I think the opposite. I think the Torah is saying the answer of it. It's a great answer. And if science comes up with something, we'll have to address it. There are plenty big atheistic scientists that are trying very hard to discover the answer to that, and time will tell. So, yeah.
So in 1966, that Nature magazine came out. 1959, the Nature magazine came out, and most scientists said that Earth was created differently or always existed, something different than the Big Bang.
Right. Basically,
so my question is, how did rabbis explain the Torah then? Were they trying to get people to think about Big Bang Theory or something similar to that, or has it kind of adapted to what the general thinking is?
And so the Torah is somewhat vague in terms of what exactly happened. Right? What happened? The earth was desolate, and this, again, it's Nachman is written early 1200s. The world was started as a tiny speck of creation, something from nothing, and from that creation, God drew out the rest of the world. The Torah does not tell us the exact process of what exactly happened. Were there hydrogen and there was other, I don't even know all these scientific terms, and how exactly they mixed and they meshed and they developed, and then the neurons connected with the photons, and then they could see light. All these things. The Torah doesn't say all these terms. The Torah just says that it was dark and then it was light, and the main point is that God created. After God created light, God separated the waters. And we'll go through the story and we'll see, as part of this class we're going to discover, do these fit as we go on, discover that. But for now, there's not really a conflict there. The Torah always said that God was the creator, and this was the order. So again, I'm going to point out one thing I forgot to mention before. Rashi brings up this point. The Torah is not necessarily coming to teach us the exact order of creation. Obviously, day 1 came before day 2, came before day 3. But for example, in the verse 2, it says that God's throne was floating atop of the water. Is that what it says, more or less? You don't have the end of verse 2? It hovered over the what?
Surface of the waters.
The surface of the waters. So when was water created? It doesn't say anywhere in the Torah water was created. It doesn't mention water being created anywhere in the Torah. So when was water created? So Rashi says, we don't know. The Torah didn't tell us. I mean, it doesn't tell us every single detail, every single thing of how it came out. There's certain information told us, and we understand what we can from that information, but we know in day 2, God separating the waters, upper waters and lower waters. When were these waters created? It never said God created water everywhere.
Is water emptiness?
Water is not emptiness. Water
But it
is
says
water.
that the earth was astonishingly empty with darkness on the surface of the deep. How does it different?
Different steps, different stages of the process, yeah. But it doesn't say anything anywhere about the water being created. So Rashi points out that the Torah is not necessarily telling us exactly the order at every single step of every single part of the process. The Torah is teaching us kind of like somewhat like a general flow. And as long as we finish that, so if we're going to say now we could understand that there were periods of, we'll get to more of the terms of the Big Bang in a little bit, but and you want to tell me that what exactly happened then was I really have a hard time saying this, I read them, I can understand it a little bit, but I don't remember all the words. The way that they were reacting was in a way that things couldn't form yet because the world was too hot and dense, and then as the world expanded, the world cooled down, and certain particles were able to interact with other particles, and that created the first hydrogen, and then that created stars, and that created, none of that scientific explanation has any problem with fitting in the Torah. Torah doesn't mention anything that doesn't fit with that. Torah doesn't tell us the exact process of what happened. As long as you believe that God is behind this process, and God is somewhat running the process, the fact that this is how the process came out is totally fine from the Torah's perspective. Does that answer your question?
Somewhat.
Okay, so we'll continue to answer it as the series goes on. We're going to discuss all these things more, and they're going to go on as we continue more as we go on. Okay, so again, third day of creation, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. So as just mentioned, post World War II, there was really a debate in the scientific community as to the origin of the world. Was it, one side said, as a thing called the static state theory, that the world always existed, and the other side was the Big Bang. Now, there were a bunch of different studies and proofs of the Big Bang. You say proof because it's still a theory and it's not a fact, so you can disprove the proofs, I guess. But the proofs of the Big Bang. So one of the proofs of the Big Bang is an amazing thing. Now, just to point out, this is the basic Big Bang theory. This is, I forgot what this is from, but you can check it out. The beginning of the cosmos, go through again. This is 10 to the negative 4. This is the trillions of a trillion of a trillion of a second. Go to this side, I'm not blocking it. The cosmos go through superfast inflation where they start expanding out from the size of an atom to that of a grapefruit in a tiny fraction of a second. And that takes us till 10 to the negative 32 seconds. From there, post-inflation, the universe is a hot tube of electrons, quarks, and particles. As it goes on to the 10 to the negative 6 second, its cooling causes its quarks to clump into protons and neutrons. Now, up to 3 minutes, it's still too hot to form into atoms. Charged electrons and protons prevent light from shining. The universe is a super hot fog. 5, electrons combine with protons and neutrons to form atoms, mostly hydrogen and helium. Now that makes the world transparent, and light can finally shine. So this is a fascinating thing. At the beginning of the world, according to science, there was a super dense, tiny point in time that rapidly expanded. As it expanded and cooled off, it turned into a universe of super hot fog, somewhat of a tohu vavohu of choshech, darkness al panei tehom, across the definite. The first thing that happens afterwards was electrons combine with protons and neutrons, and light can finally shine. Now, which is an amazing thing. Just think about that. Right? The Torah has been saying very similar to that for a very long time. This is all within the last, basically, almost a lifetime probably that's been proven. Here's an amazing thing. I can't really explain to you this picture. I can tell you what it is. This is a picture. It's called CMB. Anyone familiar with this picture? I think it was in the New York Times before we were born, but not too much before. Yeah.
I've seen this one before.
What it's called?
I don't remember what it's called, but I remember what
It's called CMB. CMB stands for Cosmic Microwave Background. And basically, in the early 70s, there were a few scientists that were trying to do certain radio things. I'm extremely oversimplifying this. And they discovered a certain like microwave thing coming from the sky. And basically, to cut a really complicated big story short, I can send you links to understand them better, is they discovered that that initial light that the world shone at the time of the Big Bang, that first point in time, step number 5, which they estimate is 380,000 years after the Big Bang itself, that point in time, that light, we actually could see that light nowadays. And that's one of the proofs of the Big Bang, because it could go back like that. And that's also how we were able to age, that adjusted the age of the Big Bang, because we were able to figure out when exactly, how long this was from us, based on the fact that as our world's expanding, so that light should still exist somewhere, expanding, going outwards. So we could somehow discover that and map it, and every color here means something else. So just a picture that represents the concept. I can't really explain to you what it meant. I tried watching a bunch of Understand CMB quickly on YouTube last night, and I didn't think anyone explained it so well. So I can't really explain it well enough, but that's the concept. CMB, Cosmic Microwave Background, was really what tipped the scale to push the scientific community over to believing the Big Bang Theory. Because now they're able to say we actually can see, from certain types of telescopes, however they figure this out, that light that came out at the time of the Big Bang, 13 billion years ago. And this is a picture of that. So that's really an amazing thing if you think about it. Again, just in terms of the evolution of what the Torah has been saying and what science is currently saying. And again, I agree with your point. If it would be 100 years ago, like in that picture, it would be harder. I would be coming probably more from tradition and telling you that our tradition states that God created the world and God started at one small point, because I would have the same Nachmanides that said the same words since 1200 and all the other rabbis of this era that wrote very similar. And it would be more of a, yes, harder to say anything, and you would either believe me or not, and you accept the tradition or not, but it would be a different conversation. Now it happens to be that science has come around to see things through the Torah's perspective. That's really what's happening here. And most of it does fit in. If you have a question though, I know you guys are going to Google it and challenge me, and I'm looking forward. All right? Okay, good. Yeah.
And one other kind of like on the same type thing. So in terms of like science, obviously like there's evolution that we evolved like over time. So could that still relate to like what's in Torah?
Right, so evolution is a huge topic in and of itself. I would say this class is more the focus of the Big Bang and certain stuff there. Evolution we're going to talk about when we get to the production of fish and animals and humans. As we get to more sophisticated life, we'll discuss in that class is the idea of whether or not Torah can fit with evolution, it connects or doesn't connect to it, how that jives or not. So it's a great question. It's just, I think, too big for right now, so we'll save that, and now you have to come back. So. If nothing else, I got that one, you know? Okay, so let's go back to Torah for a second. Back to Torah. So what we basically have discovered, and again, if you think I'm just trying to, I don't believe any of this is apologetics. I think it's quite the opposite. In my mind, what's happening here is that the Torah has been saying the truth for the past the Torah was given in 2448 of Jewish time, so that's 50, okay, this is too complicated, around basically 2,800 years ago, something like that. And even if you go with non-Jewish sources, or the earliest Christian source of it, it's still over 1,000 years ago. The Torah has been saying the story. Again, the oral law has been commenting on it and expressing a very similar concept. The fact that science agrees to it now, if nothing else, should prove to everyone that, you know, the Torah is solid. Solid. Think about it, you know? It's very interesting, intriguing. Okay, back to Torah. Let's go to verse 3. Anyone have verse 3? What does verse 3 say? Can we get a reader again? You want to repeat that as verse 3?
God said, "Let there be light," and there was light.
Okay, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. So what was this light? Questions. Anyone have questions on this verse? Let's analyze this verse. Oh yeah, for a second. That was totally not right of me. Woo! Too high. Great job there. It was an easier one than Mark, but it was still a great job. So, any questions on this verse? God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. What was this light?
Could be the sun.
So you think it could be the sun, right?
It's possible.
The problem is, go to day 4 and go to verse, I don't know what it is, say 16, 17? What does it say? It's later on in the book. Anyone have a volunteer reader? Is that where it is? Day 4?
14.
Verse 14 says, God said there be luminaries, and it says here, God made the two great luminaries. Right? In Hebrew, it's the sun and the moon. Right? So it seems like the sun and the moon were only made in day 4. So, the question to ponder here is Denise's question, right? We're sitting here, reading verse 3, and verse 3 says, God created the light. And the basic question is, if you think light is the sun, right? In our world of experience, light comes from the sun. So, what is this light that God created in the beginning? What is this light? So, Moshe Segal thinks.
Is he just talking about darkness, and then the opposition of darkness?
Okay, perfect. Opposite of darkness, meaning there could be a creation of light that's not necessarily filtering to our world through the sun, just the concept of light, right? Perfect.
I think somebody should have said fire.
Fire. Fire is interesting. There wasn't a ground yet. It could be fire. It's interesting. It could be fire. I'm not sure. The world wasn't uncovered until day 3. So I don't really know, even all these conversations we're having, trying to understand it the best that we can. Yeah, I mean, it could have been fire. I don't know. It could have been fire. Can't say anything.
Isn't our sun
fire
like
in this
a
world
ball
was
of fire?
What's that?
Isn't our sun like a ball of fire?
What was?
Isn't our sun a ball of fire?
The sun is, I mean, I guess a ball of fire. It's a ball of. It's a star.
Yeah.
Whatever all stars are. Gas. That's
Uh-huh.
that's
Fire.
yeah, fire. Yeah. So it could be a ball of fire. It could be some kind of fire. I personally, but I understand this is, I think, the way we explained it before. That initial light was God created light, right? Exactly like Jory said. Light doesn't have to be the sun, light could just be light. What was light? That light was what the Big Bang described. It was very clear. Big Bang, there's a point of starting. The world expanded. It was a dense, thick fog, to quote it, verse 2. And then the first thing that happened after that, after it cooled down a little more, it became more transparent. Things came together, and we were able to see light. That light is actually visible nowadays. In that CMB photograph we had before, we can see what that light was. What?
What's the point in that?
That was the creation of light. Then light existed. From that eventually came stars, eventually came the sun. That was the creation of light. Meaning it was a part of the process of the Big Bang. If you read it, there was first light, and then certain things that came off of that. I don't remember just all scientific terms. Eventually there were stars, and eventually there were galaxies, and that was part of the process of creation. But like we said, the first basic creation was light, which is again amazing. That was light. So that's what I would say. That's what I would say. It is an interesting thing just to think about, to try to wrap your mind around. We had that picture before of that kind of like growing sphere of the Big Bang, right? Which means that at the beginning point, Bereshit, that was the creation of time and space. That was the creation of something, right? That's just scientific, right? Not Torah also, but scientific. That creation of time and space, that expanded. Time and space expanded through that. So if you're, the closer you are to the beginning of that, this is what the word general relativity is. The relativity is between space and time, right? That was the concept. That was what Einstein hypothesized, whatever the word is, that he theorized. So as you're closer to the source, and time and space is more shrunk, more smaller, so the amount of time to get from one point in time of creation to that point in time of creation, or anywhere in the world, is obviously much smaller. The world is much smaller. So nowadays, for a ray of light to travel from the sun to Earth takes anyone from
8 minutes,
and
50 some odd seconds.
that's fantastic. 8 minutes 20 seconds. But 8 minutes 20 seconds. That's great. Mark was on my team with the Q, by the way. Last year at the YJP Trivia Night, and it's still showing now because the only questions we got right was from Mark, basically. So keep the good stuff coming. So light then, based on our distance from the sun, right? But everything is much closer. The light is much more instantaneous. Right? The light is much more. It's just there. When light was created, it got everywhere in the world much faster, just because there was less places to go. Because again, outside of that, which is concept we don't really understand, is nothing. Right? Scientifically. Right? Okay. So that's an interesting thing to recognize. I one time heard that someone, his Rabbi Segal, his Rabbi in Florida, said a very cool idea. He said the beginning of the creation of light was instantaneous. Like light got everywhere as it was created. It was everywhere. Time and space was just so much smaller. Nowadays, our light is all delayed light. We don't have light the same way it had then. And he wanted to suggest a concept that we always view light in thought as like, light is like clarity. Light is like, you view God as this like shining light. That's always what light is. Light is clarity. So I want to say that in the beginning of creation, when we were that close to the beginning, the world had like an instantaneous light. The truth and the clarity of the world was pure. Then as the world continued to develop, each stage of creation, like we said before, the word ha'olam is connected to the word ha'elam. The word world is connected to the word hidden. Part of, as our world continued to evolve, continued to come out, and continued to express itself, that hid God from the world more and more and more, as we'll discuss with continuation of it. So he brings that out from this concept of instantaneous light, which is I think a cool idea. Okay, now basic question. We keep reading, and we get to the end of day one, basically. Well, just quickly say what we had. We had light. Light was created. God saw light was good. God distinguished between light and dark. Light is day, dark is night. Vayhi erev, vayhi boker. There was evening, there was morning. Yom echad. Day one. One day. One day. So, there is a question that many people are bothered by with another one of these points of, does this fit with science or not? And that is, we spoke about last time, there's 6 olives in the first verse, remember that? Each representing 1,000 years, there's 6,000 years of this world, we're now in 5776. For holidays coming up? Rosh Hashanah. So, we normally understand the world as the earth rotating on its axis, the day is the earth rotating on its axis, right? That's what day always is. I believe that is what the word day means, rotating on its axis. Now the question is, I don't know where Rosh Hashanah is coming up, And it's about to be Shana Tova 5777, right? Coming up in a few weeks. Quick plug on the side, we're having a YGP event the night of Rosh Hashanah, YGC event also. Rabbi Avi is actually the one speaking the night of Rosh Hashanah in our Torah. Have beautiful services, and then we'll have meals. Everyone is encouraged and invited to attend as much as you can. Okay, anyways, back to our regular scheduled program. Rosh Hashanah is coming up, 5777. Now, what is this year counting from? What is Rosh Hashanah? What was done historically on Rosh Hashanah? What are we getting back to on Rosh Hashanah? Pesach, we left Egypt. Shavuot, we got the Torah. Sukkot, remember, reminds us of the desert and the huts. What is Rosh Hashanah? Anyone know?
Apples and honey.
Apples and honey. Perfect. And pomegranate. Apple and honey. What are we celebrating? So Rosh Hashanah is, what is Rosh Hashanah? The new year, right? Rosh Hashanah is a new year. So what are we celebrating? We're celebrating another year of creation. We're going from the year 5776 to year 5777. Now, what actually happened on Rosh Hashanah, the day of creation that Rosh Hashanah was the day of creation of man. Which means that the world is really going to be 5777 and 5.5 days. That's what the world really is, because the world was created 5.5 days before man. Man was created in the middle of the 6th day. First animals were created, and then man and woman. And the world was really created 5.5 days before this. So the question is, what were these days exactly? So the answer is, and I hope I don't make anyone upset right now, but the answer is I really don't know. I don't know what these 5.5 days were. There are those that claim that these 5.5 days somehow were 13 billion years, and we're really there. There's a person named Gerald Schroeder who has a very interesting concept, which anyone who wants the afterwards I can explain to you, but it's like a little speech in and of itself, how he explains it based on the theory of relativity. It plays out. Were those 5.5 days, and the world is 5777, and doesn't exist, doesn't fit with the Big Bang? It's also possible. I remember one time hearing a class from a person named Rabbi Mansour, and he says, somebody asked me, do I believe in dinosaurs? So I said, no, I don't believe in dinosaurs, I believe in God. What do you mean? He's like, dinosaurs not a matter of belief. Go to the field museum, you'll see dinosaurs. Do you believe dinosaurs? Yeah, they're dinosaurs. There's dinosaurs over there. Belief is, do you believe in God? Do you believe the world is 13.5 million years old? It's not a tenet of faith, the age of the universe. Can it fit with science? It can fit with science. You can look around, a lot of rabbis, it's speculative. The Torah doesn't tell us exactly. The Torah tells us there were 6 days of creation. Could each day have been, as time expands and time and space and things, and one day is really, from our viewpoint, 1 billion years. It's possible. If you believe that, and you recognize that God created the world, that God sent us here, and you believe what the Torah says, and you believe also that the world is 13 billion years old, that's fantastic. You're a wonderful Jew. You'll go straight to heaven afterwards. If you believe that the world is 5,777 years old, there's nothing against Judaism either one. Unfortunately, we don't have a direct answer to this question. I don't think it's a contradiction to science, because the Torah doesn't say exactly that it's this old. It doesn't say that the world couldn't have been beforehand, and there's a lot of different answers. Happy to discuss them with you afterwards. But the real point is that you don't know. So I can't tell you exactly how old the world is. I don't know. Science says 13.5 billion years. They have proof of that. I'm fine with that. I'm comfortable with that. It's not in contrast to the Torah. Okay.
So the creation of man, you talk about, but is that the actual physical creation of man, or the time when man had the cognitive, almost revolution, where they started thinking in the...
So that goes to the question of evolution. Where exactly did man come from? Was man some being that already existed that then somehow God blew in his nostrils a spirit of life and transformed us into a conscious being? Or was man somewhat of a new creation, right? Now we know there was nothing that was totally created from me. The building blocks were all already created. That was one creation ex nihilo. But then the process, so that we're going to discuss. That's a great, very basic question. It's a great question that gets into evolution and exactly how everything evolved. So that we'll have to stay close. Okay, now we already have 2 people coming to the next class. Perfect. You guys are all stuck. Any other questions? Quick, any other question? Okay, so then it's good. That's very important. We'll have to get that when we get to the creation of man. Have to figure that out. There's a cool thing. Everyone knows, when does Shabbat start? When does Jewish holiday start? When does it start? Sundown, right? Shabbat, we all know. Jewish holiday starts at sundown. How do we know that the Jewish day starts at sundown? What does the verse say? Verse 5?
God called to the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning one day.
There was evening, there was morning, right? The Torah expresses the day as there was evening, there was morning. That's the Torah's day. The Torah's day starts at night and then goes to the morning. That's the source. That's why Shabbat starts Friday night, continues to the day. Right? Jewish time starts at night, goes to the day. This is the source that the Torah is expressing here. That Jewish days start at night, which fits with what we were saying before. That time, day one, started with this blackness in the beginning, this fog, and then there was a creation of light, which was evening and morning, the first day. Right? So that's really what it was. And one day we'll send over here that it's already an hour, so we're going to say the last point why it says one day. I'll leave with a question, and anyone who wants to discuss we can, but I'll end with this, and that is if you look at all the days, it always says that God created whatever was on the second day, a second day, the third day, a third day, fourth day, a fourth day, right? Second, third, fourth. It's all in relative terms. It doesn't say day 2, day 3, day 4. It says a second, a third, a fourth. With that consistency, it should say a first day, a first, a second, a third, a fourth. But it doesn't. It says day 1, a second, a third, a fourth. So the question is why? Why would God write it like that, not like anything else? And with that, food for thought, we can discuss. Everyone's invited to Shabbat. We can discuss the Shabbat meal this week. Everyone's invited. And that's the class. Thank you ever so much for coming. Everyone's welcome to stick around, eat and drink more. And any questions are definitely invited if anyone has anything else they want to say or share. Give them a look from Eli.